Hello, loves, and welcome to Becoming the Sexual Priestess. I have been so incredibly looking forward to this very special event. And really, it's more than an event in my heart. It means so much in the world, and that will make sense as I continue to talk about why this is all so beautifully important at this time. And speaking of this particular moment in time, you may notice that the light on my face from the window looks like it's fading a little bit, and that's because it is. There's actually a solar eclipse happening as I'm speaking right now. And I know many of you, in fact, most of you will be watching this course over years to come. And so there may not be an eclipse going on right at the moment that you're watching it, but there will be that energy involved in this particular video anyway. And the reason that that's so fitting, this is a solar eclipse with a new moon, is that that means it's a very potent time of transformation. And regardless of whether you're watching this during a new moon or eclipse or not, it marks a potent time of new transformation for you as you watch this material and begin on this journey. And I don't say begin on this journey because you're just getting started. I mean, many of you may be well versed in sacred sexuality, self-love. Maybe you've even had an interest in an exploration as the sexual priestess, right? But wherever you are with all of it, whether this is all brand new material for you or you feel very far along on your journey in some way related to it, this marks a new beginning. So the material in this course is going to touch your life in a way that is significant, remarkable, beautiful, and far beyond just, again, a course or an event, because the material that is contained here is ancient, not just ancient historically, but ancient inside of you, ancient in your cells and in your bones, and that's where you'll be having this remembering, not of something I'm showing you, but of something of your essence in some beautiful way. So as I was saying about this course, I call it a mini course because it's not as long as my other courses, as my full-length courses, I should say, but also because it is more information intensive. So we'll be exploring through words, but I won't be giving specific practices per se. I won't be taking us on sound journeys or other journeys, and you can definitely check out my other courses if you're interested in that, my full-length courses. I go into plenty of that kind of thing there. But here, again, there will still be journeys, but they will come through what I share solely in words and in what that inspires in you. So sometimes I like to call this portion of any of my teachings story time. Now, that isn't because I'm only going to tell stories. I will be telling some stories today. But it's because I have this beautiful memory of seeing a group of very young children listening to a story being read to them in a one-room schoolhouse one time. And they all were on the floor and they all had pillows they could hold on to, they could sit or lay down, they could listen in any way that they wanted to. And they were in such peace, they felt safe. But that was what was transmitted. That's what I could feel from it. They had roses in their cheeks and they could explore with their imagination while they listened. It wasn't like a lecture where they had to pay attention to every bit of information and then be able to regurgitate it, on a test. They could just let the words reach them in whatever way felt natural. So you may want to take notes. You may want to pay attention to every word. I love doing that. Or you may want to just be in a semi-altered state and see what comes across. And the beautiful thing is you can listen to this as many times as you want. You could listen to it in a very altered state at first, And then you could decide to listen another time and take notes. I mean, it's really up to you. Listening in a space that's as comfortable as possible is a wonderful thing to do. And I know sometimes it's just going to work out that the only way you can listen to this is, after work when everybody leaves and you're at your desk, and maybe it's not the comfiest place in the world, but you're here. And that's what really matters. But if you have a chance to get really cozy, maybe have a couple of your favorite beverages or light some candles or do whatever you'd like to make your space sensual, to make your space feel good. Maybe it's just having a pillow or a few pillows like those kids did when they were listening to story time. It's up to you. So I have so much to tell you all, and I'm really excited to do it. And before I dive in, I do want to just have a few deep breaths together for anyone who would like to join me. And there's no right way to do this. I mean, I'm saying deep breaths because that sounds good to me right now, but your breath can be at any level you'd like it to be. Or you may not feel like focusing on your breath, and that's fine. But you're welcome to join me now if you'd like. Wonderful. I'm just feeling the energy of being here and the energy of all of you who will be listening when this is first released, all of you who will listen over time, over years, all of you who will be listening from down the street or from the other side of the world. And boy, the word beautiful doesn't seem strong enough to explain how incredible it feels to commune with this group. So thank you for deciding to sign up for a course about the sexual priestess. So I want to say something about gender and this course because it's open to all genders. Certainly the word priestess refers to or has connotations with the female gender. So a few things about that. First of all, the lineage of many lineages of ancient sexual priestesses from around the world throughout a wide span of time. Typically, this was a female tradition. I am talking about a tradition that was a female tradition. Having said that, there are people alive now who may be somewhere else on the gender continuum. They may be male or have a different gender identity than female, and yet they were a sexual priestess in the past. And then beyond that, we all have an inner sexual priestess. So let's say you're here and you're a man. You may feel that you are drawn to this work because you want to understand the role that the sexual priestess might play in your life. And that might be a person outside of you that is embodying their sexual priestess, and that has a healing impact on your relationship with them or on your life in some way. This may speak to you not as a sexual priestess or as someone searching for an inner sexual priestess, but as someone who wants to be in support of sexual priestesses or wants to benefit from the healing and beauty that can come from having a sexual priestess in your life, in your world. So you get to decide how this applies to you and how it speaks to you. And then also, genitalia does not denote gender necessarily, right? So you may be a woman listening who may be intersexed and You may be a woman listening who is transgendered, and you may have a vagina or you may have a penis. And you may have a penis, and you may feel that when I'm speaking later about vaginas, you are correlating that to your penis, or you may feel that you do have, energetically speaking, a vagina, or that your penis represents your vagina or is your vagina. So that word may still be exactly what you're imagining and working with and connecting with. So it's not necessarily imagining, but energetically engaging with, right? So same for anyone listening who may be male, but may also have a penis, And if that's the case, you may be listening to this information when I talk about vaginas and thinking, okay, this is helpful for me in thinking about people I know with vaginas or whatever. Or you could apply some of it to how you feel about your own genitalia or your own exploration. So again, this is wide open. But it's so important that we know and, that it not be limited to only a select few understanding about the sexual priestess, because the sexual priestess is a healing heritage of this world, of our history, of our current reality, and here on earth that is beyond description in its value. Something I certainly wish everyone in the world knew about, and something that is returning to our consciousness. So, having said that, this particular session is about the ancient sexual priestesses, or what I sometimes call the sacredly sexual priestesses, why they mattered and why they matter now. So, a great place to start is, what is a sexual priestess? Now, some of you may have noticed that I had an additional recommended video with this course that is called What is Sacred Sexuality? And I really recommend watching that video to get an even deeper foundation of why I would refer to something as sacred or sacredly sexual priestess or whatever. And that I'm not excluding other types of priestesses, and I'm not excluding other types of sexuality that are not quote unquote sacred. However, as I share in that video, sacred sexuality is your sexuality. It is already sacred. But the more you get in touch with how sacred it is, the more you experience it authentically, the more sacred it will feel to you. And the more you will be tapping into that magic and into those mysteries and those alchemies that are typically thought of as sacred sexuality. So, one of the things I also share in that video that at least I should share in a basic way is that we live in a sexual universe. And a lot of times people get nervous about labeling something as sexual, but in its essence, sexuality is life force. Sexuality is the movement of a universe discovering itself through creation, things that are created, experiences, embodiments, because it's in love with itself. So sacred sexuality is the universe making love to itself. Everything comes from that. Everything comes from love, even when that doesn't seem possible. And that love is sexuality. It may not be overt sexuality like a lot of people think of, involving somehow the genitals or a certain type of experience that might lead toward climax or something. We're talking about the pure pulsing life force in your body, the pure pulsing life force in your heart, the pure pulsing life force, yes, in your genitals, yes, in your mind, yes, in your fingertips, yes, yes. We're talking about that pure pulsing life force in nature. And we're talking about returning to that pure pulsing life force. And that is a big part of what it is to be a sexual priestess. So before I go on, I did want to say that, when I talk about the sexual priestess, you'll notice that I am speaking of some more specific traditions, but also any priestess that truly walked what we would call that path, was also a sexual priestess, because understanding of this life force was fundamental to any priestess tradition. Perhaps not priestess traditions that had become lost during the time of what I call the Great Forgetting, but times that, priestesshoods were truly connected to love as the essence of all things. Sexuality was part of that, even if that sexuality was simply practiced with oneself, or in periods when it was not practiced at all in the more overt way, but was a communion with the universe or with nature or with our bodies without that necessarily overt experience of sexuality. Because any priestess who had free will, which was crucial to true priestesshood, who wasn't bogged down by dogma, could engage with her own body and the universe and nature in whatever way felt truly right. Of course, and always with the intention of not doing harm. We cannot control whether harm comes from our actions and or how to always label whether something was harmful or not ultimately. Because, we could bump into a table where a vase is broken. I know that's not a living thing, and then, later someone could step on a piece of it, but that could lead to something else that actually was beneficial for that person. I mean, it's very tricky when you look at it that way, but we can always intend not to do harm, which is crucial and really the only thing I could ever describe as something that I hold as more universal in terms of intention, right? So those of us who would listen to a course like this, we intend love, best of our abilities. And sometimes love doesn't look like we expect it to. Love is not always a greeting card. There are these amazing, wrathful goddesses and other deities that burn powerfully with that love. So it's not about how it looks. And it's not about not deviating from somehow this path that's supposed to look like love. This is about authenticity. And that's the most direct path to our essence. And that's what the sexual priestesses modeled. So all priestesses were sexual priestesses in some way, right? But some lineages walked this path much more, in a much more focused way, where sexuality and this remembering of these energies was key and was considered to hold the world in harmony and in peace. So essentially the sexual priestesses came from traditions all over the world. So historically they're talked about, though not nearly enough, in a lot of the Mediterranean areas, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece. It goes on and on from there. But this is much more widespread. These traditions were very powerfully in place all over the planet for a very long period of time in different forms. One thing they all had in common, however, is that they were masters of life force and love. Masters of life force and love. They were leaders and teachers and healers. They taught with their presence, with their words, with their energy, with their touch in some cases. And they were the kind of leaders we would think of as being spiritual leaders, right? So we don't really have anyone quite in that position now, but there are some close approximations. But these women led. They were the role models, and not because they had to seize power or misuse power in any way, because they had true power and they reminded others of their true power. So someone who wanted false power would try to gain leadership that made others feel that they were less powerful, right? And that's ultimately what ended the era of the sexual priestess as we might think of it in ancient times, but it never really ended completely because it's living on with all of us, actually, and will be living on more and more. It's inside. So these sexual priestesses, these leaders, teachers, and healers brought people back to love, brought people back to the remembering of their own essence as love. They taught people to love more by accessing that essence, and how to also access their life force more profoundly when they had forgotten. So if you think about how much the world needs that right now, to remember access to the love that they are and to their life force, you can see why this role is so incredibly critical. And when you think about the fact that it was believed that the role of these sexual priestesses actually kept the world in harmony or in peace, you can imagine how much that role is incredibly needed in the world right now. So when I say the return of the sexual priestess will change the world, I am not kidding. I am talking about the restoration of a peaceful world, and not by having to fight and struggle. We have fought and struggled through what I call the Great Forgetting for so long now. This will come from our joy and our pleasure. And that can be hard to believe when we've struggled so long. I do understand that. And all of that will make more sense as I continue to speak and share as well. So, another name for this sexual priestess that is often used is the sacred prostitute or the sacred whore. I have really grown fond of the term whore, and I'll explain why in a little while. But generally I like sexual priestess or sacredly sexual priestess because of the feelings that it conjures for me. But those other terms are absolutely usable as well. The thing is that they were not just bringers of healing through sex specifically. Not to minimize that potential, which is phenomenal and hugely important, which is why the word sexual is very important in the sexual priestess label that I use. So sexuality, hugely important component. It's just not the only one. So while later, as these traditions did become more dogmatized and stigmatized and many other things, there was a lot of control over these priestesses, and they were not free to do as they wished and to follow that inner pulse. Later, they were often in a position where they met with people who came to the temple for healing, and they would simply offer some kind of sexual interaction as a loving healing experience. And some of that may have retained that wisdom from before, and some of it may not have. Certainly when a woman is pressured and forced to do anything, there's no sacred sexuality in that, except for the deepest layer where all is sacred and where we are sacred always in our essence. So what I'm essentially saying is that the sacred prostitute or sacred whore or sexual priestess had many, many gifts to offer. And healing through sexual touch was just one of them, as was healing through sexual energy, healing through communication about life force, energy, sexuality, love, etc. So, a few examples of sexual priestesses around the world. The goddess Inanna from ancient Sumeria is a goddess I just absolutely love and whose story I tell and talk about a lot. Her priestesses were all considered sacred prostitutes. Her entire following, they were all sacred prostitutes, and she was often referred to as the great goddess Har, which is where we get harlots. And her temples, actually, the early temples, some of the earliest writing in the world, if not the earliest writing in the world, are stories of Inanna on ancient Sumerian tablets. And her temples where the priestesses were sacred prostitutes were where it is believed the original math, arithmetic, and, as I said, writing came from. So many of the roots, that's because I should explain, the sacred priestesses of Inanna at her temples would, for instance, be in charge of how much was stored in terms of grains or whatever else at the temple, and they would create simple math and keep tablets to keep up with certain things like that, because by that time that we're talking about, the temples were helpful in terms of overseeing the village that they were a part of, right? So, and again, it is believed that these priestesses created some of the initial alphabet that those Sumerian tablets contain writing from. And the reason I'm kind of stumbling as I speak a little bit, I don't know if you can hear it, but I feel it inside, is because I know there was earlier writing than that, because I remember. But it's still impressive that at least as of now, according to historical information, that is the earliest writing. Because what it says is that these sacred prostitutes began potentially, or even somewhat began, writing and math for all humankind. And the challenge is, and we know this, we hear about it now, I'm so glad it gets talked about more, but spirituality and sexuality were divided in order to conquer people. There were two powerful tools that were used. One is that as long as your spirituality was your sexuality, meaning your life force and your vital energy pulsing through you, you knew what was right and wrong inside of you, and you couldn't be overpowered. But once those two things were split, and then you could shame sexuality and the body, you could disempower people in a heartbeat. And that's what happened. And that's why the sexual priestesses at that time, at the time when this shift began to occur, needed to be wiped out so that people could gain false power over the populations that had the role models of the sexual priestess to bring them back to love and their own inner power. So, there were temple dancers in what is now called India, at least in my language, in very ancient times that were pre-Vedic. And so these we're talking about pre-Upanishads, right? Like really far back in these tantric goddess traditions. Most of the tantra we think of now was actually a revival of those ancient ways later. And these temple dancers, even in the sort of the revival times of tantra, were taught at least 64 arts in many cases. They were phenomenally educated and highly esteemed. And this is later on, after the great golden era of the sexual priestess. So these were temple dancers, devadasis, maharis. We also have some great references in Greece. I mean, there are way too many references to sacred prostitutes and sexual priestesses for me to possibly cover, including my memories of them. But I wanted to give you guys a sense, a feeling for a few examples. So the Hore were actually nymphs, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. They were thought of as the keepers of the hours, and many words come from this. One of them that's related to that is whore, and there are iterations of this, of sacred prostitutes and sexual priestesses with names similar to Hore. So they were also dancers and keepers of the hours, as I said, which referred to their hourly temple dances once priestesses took over the roles of these sacred nymphs. Mary Magdalene was a sacred prostitute. And as I say that, I get chills because Mary Magdalene has come so powerfully into the mass awareness again. Her time has returned on this earth. She too was taken out of the stories, right? And she too has returned. And her returning to more conscious awareness in the mass, public awareness is also a heralding of this return of the sexual priestess, because the world needs radical support to make this shift into what we're wanting to call the new world or the new earth. And the sexual priestesses can guide us again. And not again through struggle or because they have to or in order to just be of service. The only way to be of service as a sexual priestess is to follow your own heart's desires, to bring yourself pleasure and joy. And the ripple effect of that and the way it changes everything in your life and world is incredible. And while it may seem to rock the boat at first, upset the apple carts of the others around you, it's ultimately the best thing for them as well. And whatever needs to shift, whatever relationships or friendships or family dynamics need to shift around it, in order for you to have that experience, it is for the best. So Mary Magdalene is a wonderful example of the sacred prostitute returning in the world and of the power of the sexual priestess. So the virgin and the whore are actually one. There's a lot of talk about that dichotomy. Women are expected to somehow be both virginal and saintly and whorish and sexy, and yet to be ashamed of one or the other, it's a painful impossibility. And yet, actually, when we realize that the virgin and the whore are the same thing, both are words that were used in ancient times for the sacred prostitute and the sexual priestess in the highest regard, highest possible regard. So, virgin meant one who owns herself. And that is why the sexual priestesses were called virgins, because even into the time where women had started to become more like property, the sexual priestesses maintained their autonomy, and certainly prior to that as well. And whore also meant sacred one, as virgin did, holy one. So the virgin whore is the sacred, holy, revered one who owns herself, who knows herself. So when the sacred prostitute needed to be taken from her position, the goddess religion needed to be overthrown. Now, the goddess religion was not just about making some kind of feminine principle better than a masculine principle at all. It was simply one way to experience the divine in its wholeness. The goddess could be feminine and masculine. And of course, even when the goddess was being experienced as full femininity in some way, femininity is in all things, everything. So again, we're not limited to gender here. Also, there are times where the goddess religion was exquisite. Again, the world was in beautiful, incredible harmony. And later times during the forgetting where there were imbalances and things were not at their best because forgetting had begun. And if you want to read more about the great forgetting and what I call the great remembering, which is happening now, I recommend my book, The Oracle Within. So one of the really big reasons that the sacred prostitute needed to no longer be a role model, as I mentioned, was so that people's personal power could be, their deep, true soul power could be forgotten within them, and then they could be overpowered by false power, right? Another reason was that the religions that were coming into the world and into many areas of goddess religion were male-based, and not just male-based, they were out of balance male religions with male leaders that were, again, out of balance, because it would be terrible to just say, oh, they were male, so therefore they were, barbaric and horrible? That's not male inherently. That's just out of balance, just like there can be out of balance female or any other gender. But it was very out of balance, very brutal. And it wasn't enough to just, try to bring in their new religion. These ancient religions were very entrenched, and they had these beautiful symbols of the sexual priestesses. So they had to disenfranchise. And in many cases, they needed to wipe out and kill many, many people and many sexual priestesses, which is why some people who have a past around sexual priestesshood specifically, because we all have one within us, a sacredly sexual priestess, and especially the women walking on this earth. But some of us are very connected because we've lived that in the past. It's been a direct focus for us. We've been lived as a sexual priestess. So some of us may be afraid to re-access these gifts because we have these past life memories and current life memories, right? Around sexuality being shamed or repressed, or any of our gifts, our self-love, our intuition, etc. But as I was saying, these male, out of balance male leaders, came into these traditions where property was passed from woman to woman because at the time, women had no way of knowing who the father of a child was. So communities raised children together. Men would be present for multiple children and in their lives in some way. Because unless a woman only had sex with one man at a time, which some women certainly must have, right? But not all, because that was just one choice that could be made. Then, fathers were not, it was easier to pass from mother to child, and specifically to daughter, and then have that continue on. So in order to pass from male to male, they needed to also make women monogamous, and basically make them monogamous for fear of death. Monogamy is a beautiful sexual option that many people love, or love for periods of their life, or is most right for them. That doesn't make other choices wrong or bad. However, we've been quite indoctrinated to think that that is the only option ever, and that anything else is unacceptable and even punishable. The cautionary tales are endless, starting with Eve. Starting earlier, starting with Lilith and further back, but let's just say starting with Eve, right? We needed cautionary tales. If the woman picks the apple, which could represent so many things, if she listens to her serpent life force, not only will she be cursed and thrown out from paradise, but the entire world will suffer as a result, right? That's pretty fucking heavy burden to place on women. And it is one of countless stories. I always tell this story, and I like to say that I don't think it would happen now because I think the world has changed a lot in the last 15 years. I really do, even though not nearly as much as we'd all like it to have changed, and I understand that. But I have my ear to the earth, and I can hear the shifting happening. I can feel it. In any case, I once dressed up as Eve. I felt like I was getting a lot of finger pointing at that particular moment in my life that was unnecessary and strange. So I dressed up as Eve for a costume party. Got like a nude bodysuit, and I wrapped vines around myself and leaves, and then I wore like a replica of a real snake, like a fake snake, but it looked pretty realistic, around my neck. And I had a wreath in my hair, and I brought apples. I bought a lot of red shiny apples because I figured everybody was going to want to bite. And so I had a big bag of them. And all evening at the party, I offered people apples. And there were a lot of people there, and almost nobody took me up on it. And when I excitedly thrust an apple with so much joy in the face of some people, not like scary in their face, like I just held it out like an excited child, I literally had, especially men, back away from me and then say no thanks. And the only people who said yes were two women. A lot of women said no. And those two women said, "Oh, hell yeah, I want a bite of that apple." And the one thing that made me happy was that, I do live in a really special rural area, and I was at a party that was not full, it wasn't very mainstream, just sort of it didn't have a mix of a lot of different types of people. There were more earthy types of people there. But none of the kids there knew who I was as Eve. They didn't know the story of Adam and Eve. And that made me happy. In any case, I like to think now that if I dressed up as Eve, a lot more people would bite the apple. I can feel it. So, in the beginning, though it's funny to talk about beginnings in a timeless time, but I do want to talk about the nymphs because they were what you might call the original sexual priestesses. So the nymphs were essentially what we'd call magical beings. Some people might call them mythical, but they were quite real. They were immortal, and they were always female, or what we would term now intersexed in some way. So variations in genitalia were not thought of as different, really, in more of these what I'd call magical times. But in any case, and I always like to mention that because, it's just not mentioned. And I think that that's all of these unmentioned things are places where healing could be so powerful in this world. I mean, how is it that in all the sexuality material that I have been exposed to in my life, the subject of being intersexed or transgendered is so rarely touched on? And it is touched on, and I'm always so heartened when it is. And transgender and intersexed are two totally different things potentially, or one person could be both, or have other names or labels that are unrelated or related or choosing their own. I mean, the variation is so beautiful. And I'm so glad that's coming back into our global discussion because these diversities were so beautifully honored once and absolutely should be again. Like we should all be honored for our beautiful sexualities and our beautiful bodies, right? Like it should be honored whether our breasts are small or large or this way or that way, or whether we've had surgery and double mastectomy or whether let's go on and on and on. There's nothing unsacred about our bodies. And we may not feel that they're sacred, or we may not fully embrace them as gorgeous yet. That's fine. It's an amazing journey. And I love to teach about it, and I will get to talk about it in this course as well. Body love. So I've gone on and on here, and yet I really can't do justice to everything I could say about all these incredible variations in our sexuality, but I know it's so important to mention. So in the beginning there were the nymphs, and they were these amazing female beings. And for the nymphs, they lived in a state that we would now call enlightenment. And they are really some of the most masterful beings I have ever encountered. And in my journeys as an oracle, I'm in communication with every kind of deity, ascended master, master healer, this, that, right? And just beings that to me don't have a title like that, but are so incredible. They don't have that special name. They're not known as a certain kind of saint or whatever. But the nymphs for me are just phenomenal. I mean, just basically keep in mind that they were omnipresent, omnipotent. And they are and were beings that lived in a state that we would think of as a varying level of orgasm. So bliss in varying levels. They were incredibly connected to nature. In fact, they didn't feel any distinction between themselves and nature. Their bodies were nature. We are animals. They were animals as well, even though they weren't technically human. They did interbreed with humans and actually have daughters typically, or children that were sometimes intersexed, named Sibyls. They were called Sibyls, and they were ancient prophetesses of incredible power. And they were half human and half immortal, lived for hundreds of years. And like their mothers, the nymphs, they loved to be around caves and springs because it was all about the Earth Mother. It's all about nature. And caves were like being inside of the Earth Mother, and springs bubbled up from the Earth Mother. So in very, very early times when nymphs coexisted in a visible, interactive way with humans on the Earth, the nymphs were thought of as the original oracles or sexual priestesses. So the nymphs could hear the messages from the universe, from nature, from the earth, from the bubbling of the spring that reminded people of their true nature. They would share those messages, or they could just share it with their presence. Now, nymphs, that's where nymphomaniac comes from, and the idea is that they just laid around and had orgiastic times. And I'm not going to lie, that's most of what happened, and it was amazing. Some of the most beautiful memories I've ever had of my past life experiences were as a nymph. Just exquisite beyond all measure. I mean, just imagine dimensions of pleasure that are unimaginable almost, from just touching your body to rolling your back against moss. I mean, just absolutely exquisite. We have that capacity in us right now, all the time. I've experienced it as a human in this body. So it's important that we know that being a nymph or a sexual priestess or any of this is not just about excluding negative emotions. A huge part of what I teach about self-love, with self-love as the foundation for all of everything else that I teach, is about embracing the whole of what you feel, the whole of your experience as a human, not just the parts that look shiny and quote-unquote spiritual or quote-unquote sacredly sexual or deeply in tune with your intuition, but all of it. That's where the radical change lies, and I'll get to talk more about that. But the nymphs were, yes, orgiastic. They could have sexual interactions by having the wind blow across them, or having touch with another person, or having energetic communion with another person, another nymph, a human, other magical creatures. They had a lot of options. However, they did not just lay there waiting for whatever. They had such power that you could not actually enter their field unless you were pure of heart. Now, it's a little hard to say what exactly. It's not like pure of heart is like you're at 98% pure of heart, so you don't get in, but if you get your 2%, you come in. It's just a frequency. It's a resonance that had to be achieved. It had to be connected enough to heart energy, if you want to call it that, or love, to get into the field of the nymph. Now, that doesn't mean that people who were really, really disconnected had no chance at healing. Even being near the field of a nymph could start to shift their vibration. So imagine how powerful they were, though, that you couldn't even enter their energy field unless you were resonant. They didn't have to struggle or choose or fight or anything like that. So there is nothing wrong with orgies, and lots of them. It was just important for me to distinguish that it doesn't mean that they had no boundaries, and that having no boundaries is the way to be sacredly sexual. A nymph could choose to just be sexual with herself or one person for whatever period of time or whatever else. This is always, when I teach, going to be about options based on what feels right to you and what is in alignment with your essence, your authenticity and truth, rather than anyone else's. And that's all that you will see me promoting. So, I want to just add one more thing to this particular session on, who the ancient sexual priestess was, why she mattered so much, and why the sexual priestess can matter so much in the world now. In the upcoming sessions, I'll get to talk more about what the sexual priestess did or could do now, and then how to access more of that within you. So that's all coming. But in terms of why and how much the sexual priestess matters now in the world, I mentioned, if we valued ourselves and our bodies, imagine how different we would treat ourselves, how differently we'd take care of ourselves, how different we'd be in our relationships, how differently we'd all treat the earth, which is huge, right? If we want to continue to be a human race on this earth, we have to radically turn our direction to changing our relationship with the earth. That happens very naturally when you reconnect with nature, fall in love with nature, and experience your body, fall in love with your body, and understand inherently your interdependence with nature. And also, we are experiencing in the world an epidemic of low life force, ill health, disconnection to that pulse within us and to our true essence as love, right? This has happened for a long time through what I call the Great Forgetting. It's certainly continuing to happen now in a very big way, and yet the world is ripe for change. Some of you are nodding your heads. You're thinking, yep, I feel it too. It is ripe for change. You hear many people talking about it, and it's like many birds starting to sing about spring. So, another epidemic in the world, epidemic of unsatisfying sex and sexless relationships, and there's a lot of it. And I know that not only because of, let's say, information I've read or statistics, and I know that also not only because of the courses that I've taught for over 12 years now about sacred sexuality, and I've heard from so many people, and women primarily, who I've worked with the most, about, unsatisfying sexual life. And I've worked with both men and women and people of other genders as well, also, in all of my courses. But the sacred sexuality work has mostly, I've heard from and engaged with women and done courses for women. And then on top of that, I released a survey a year ago. And I have heard from, at this point, over 150 women. And it's shocking how many are not happy with their sex lives, their sexuality. I mean, honestly, it's almost every single person who has replied. Women from the ages of, 18 or 19 to 70 some years old. And I hope to receive responses from women even older. Very much so. Women from all kinds of situations and for so many different reasons. Single women, women in relationships. It's staggering. And that had been my experience of talking to women, my experience from women in the courses, that it was much higher than the numbers that I'd even seen in, for instance, statistics. So I know that means that women's partners can't be too thrilled with sex either. So women's partners of any gender at all cannot possibly be that thrilled with their sex lives. And I am going to create other surveys to gather more of that information. Because if you're with a woman in any way that isn't happy sexually, then the sex can only be so good. And so sexuality is so much more than just the act of, again, overt sex as we think of it. And becoming happy sexually is not something that happens in most cases as a result of something you do with another person. It's something that happens inside of you. And then that can change what happens with another person, or it could change your relationship status, or meaning you might not stay with the same person, or it could change. I mean, there's so many things it could change, but it all starts right here. And that's where we're going to start. And that's what the rest of this course is going to be about. It's how to access that and change your entire life, including your sexuality, your relationship to your spirituality, because once again, they are one and the same. Your relationship to your body, your relationship to other people, your relationship to abundance, your relationship to your intuition, your relationship to feeling connected to the earth, nature, on and on and on. All of this is incredibly shifted by this reconnection with your authentic essence that can be found so beautifully by reconnecting with the sexual priestess. So I'm so excited to continue on with this course. I'm so delighted that I got to share this session during this really amazing eclipse and heralding with a new moon at this moment for me as I'm recording this, what is also a new moon in a larger sense, a new beginning in a larger sense for all of us, for everyone listening right now, wherever you are, whatever time you're listening to this. So I love you all, and I will see you all again very soon.